1/4 of humanity, 2 billion people, live in conflict, according to the United Nations. Those driving this violence are accused of turning a blind eye to international law and human rights. As flagrant violations go unpunished, I ask the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights about the erosion of trust in the global system and whether the UN can restore its credibility and overcome the loss of faith in its institutions.
I can tell you, when it comes to accountability, my office has been clear for a very long time, because we have been monitoring and documenting human rights violations both in Gaza and in the West Bank for years. So I hope that this current crisis is a wake-up call to take accountability more seriously.
Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri. Welcome to Bigger Than Five, where we explore the shifting balance of power and the challenges to the international order. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly over 75 years ago in the aftermath of the Second World War, committed member states to recognize that all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Today, with conflicts raging across the world and human rights under attack, that commitment has come under intense scrutiny. In Gaza, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights warned last month that the extent of Israel's continued restrictions on the entry of aid and the manner in which it continues to conduct hostilities may amount to the use of starvation as a method of war, which is a war crime, he said. I asked Volker Turk about the UN's inability or unwillingness to hold nations like Israel to account, despite these serious accusations. That interview in a moment, but first, a look at the global human rights system, how it was founded, and how war and conflict have made the principles on which it's based more elusive today than ever. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted on the 10th of December 1948. Drafted by a UN committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, it enshrined the rights and freedoms of all human beings. Of the 58 UN member states at the time, 48 voted in favor, 8 abstained, and 2 did not vote. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was established in 1993. Opening the 55th session of the Human Rights Council this year, the current High Commissioner said, "Rarely has humanity faced so many spiraling crises," noting that 55 conflicts around the world are battering people's lives, destroying economies, and profoundly damaging human rights. War now casts its shadow across the planet, and the UN estimates 1/4 of humanity, that's 2 billion people, now live in conflict zones. The world is seeing the highest number of violent conflicts since the end of the Second World War. According to the UN, more than 270 million people will need humanitarian assistance this year, a 17% increase from 2021, and it will cost $41 billion to alleviate the suffering of more than 180 million people in need of aid. In 2024, almost 8 decades since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 2.2 billion people still live without access to safe drinking water, and 3.5 billion lack access to decent sanitation. With the UN human rights system facing its toughest challenge yet, I sat down recently with the High Commissioner Volker Turk at his office in Geneva. High Commissioner, human rights are in retreat globally. At the beginning of your term in office, you said that your biggest concern was the widespread flouting of international humanitarian law. Is that still your biggest concern, your main worry?
It is one of my biggest concerns, because if you look at the world today, we have 55 conflicts, violent situations where civilians bear the brunt of warfare, bear the brunt of violations of international humanitarian law, bear the brunt of being affected by warmongers and those who wage war. So yes, it's one of my biggest concerns.
As you point out, it is civilians who bear the brunt in each and every one of these conflicts, but perhaps nowhere more than in Gaza. You've been sounding the alarm on Gaza for a while. You say there appear to be no bounds, no words to capture the horrors that are unfolding before our eyes in Gaza. You mentioned that there are over 100,000 people killed or wounded. About 1 in every 20 children, women, and men are now dead or wounded. But words aren't enough, are they? Can you hold Israel to account for these alleged war crimes?
So that's my biggest frustration. It is that we have the law, we see what is happening, we monitor and document, and then where does it lead to? But I'm very glad that the International Court of Justice, for example, came out with very strong provisional measures in order to ensure that the plausible case of genocide is averted. And that's an obligation for everyone, including Israel, as well as all those countries that have influence over it.
Do you accept the interim ruling of the ICJ that Israel has plausibly committed genocide in Gaza?
So the International Court of Justice, by issuing these provisional measures on the 26th of January, issued a legally binding obligation to do everything within everyone's power to avert the plausibility of genocide.
But beyond the obligations that Israel has flouted ever since the ICJ came to that conclusion, do you accept that at the very least, Israel may be committing plausible acts of genocide?
So this is for the court to decide, and this is always very complex in the midst of hostilities to actually establish this. But what the court said, what the top court of the world said, is that there is a plausible case of it. And that's already a lot.
You're a human rights lawyer. More than 70% of civilian infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed. More than 80% of healthcare facilities have come under attack. More than 70% of schools have been destroyed or damaged. 85% of the population has been displaced. As we've just said, 100,000 killed or injured. The list goes on. What is the threshold that Israel must cross for the world to call this a genocide and for justice to be delivered to Palestinians?
So, the fact that there have been very serious violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, as you have just mentioned, including the very fact that you have over 33,000 people being killed, 70% of whom are women and children, is a very strong case that there are very serious crimes that are being committed. So for genocide to be determined, so that's really for the court to determine.
Sure, the court could determine, but many international legal experts and some world leaders have already called it a genocide. In fact, the latest report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, Francesca Albanese, is entitled Anatomy of a Genocide. In it, she says the overwhelming nature and scale of Israel's assault on Gaza and the destructive conditions of life it has inflicted reveal an intent to physically destroy Palestinians as a group. She says the threshold for determining whether or not Israel is committing genocide has already been met. Can you disagree?
I've been absolutely clear right from the start that very serious violations have occurred. War crimes, potentially atrocity crimes. And let's bring it back to the level of what is happening. As we speak, in northern Gaza, children are dying of hunger. So this raises very serious concerns again. But the court has already said there is a plausible case to be made. And that's what the court is doing. And that's, for us, the authority that determines it.
Why not call a spade a spade? You mentioned the issue of intent. The most difficult part of proving genocide is intent.
Yes.
Because there has to be an intention to destroy, quote, in whole or in part, a particular group. In this case, though, the intent by Israeli leaders has been so explicitly, so publicly stated, from the prime minister to the president, to cabinet members, to military leaders, just about everyone has made the intention quite clear. It's on the public record.
So I have been absolutely clear when we heard the first language that was used, which was very dehumanizing of Palestinians, that this is utterly unacceptable and that this could raise concerns when it comes to plausibility of genocide and atrocity crimes. We have also said the same when it comes to incitement to hatred and violence, because it could create an atmosphere that allows all kinds of things to happen. By the way, the same also on the Hamas side, because we have also seen language which is dehumanizing. So really, the issue is that everyone has to refrain from using this type of language.
But can you hold a group as accountable as a government? Or should we expect more from governments who've signed up to the Geneva Conventions?
There are clear obligations on all parties to a conflict. And they have to respect international humanitarian law, and they have to respect international human rights law. And that's very key in this. And we have always pointed out what has been happening, and we will continue doing so, and the court will ultimately decide. I've also been absolutely clear that dehumanizing language is very dangerous in the current context and could lead to all kinds of indications of what the intention of the party is.
It's one thing, though, High Commissioner, to call the situation dehumanizing. It's quite another to say that what's going on is genocide.
So right from the start, I have been very clear about the commission of very serious violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, including possibility of commission of war crimes, possibility of commission of atrocity crimes, and I've warned about it, for instance, on the 6th of December, just to give you an example. But to determine genocide is not for me. That is a pending issue before the highest court of the world, the International Court of Justice, and it's for the court to determine it.
But of course, it's also the actions that many people have said are genocidal acts.
When it comes to the destruction of civilian infrastructure, when it comes to the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, when it comes to the lack of respect for fundamental principles of necessity, precaution, disproportionality. So it's clear that we have been documenting what has been happening.
Is it time to go further? The former director of the New York office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Craig Mokhaiber, accused the UN of failing to act and prevent what he said was a textbook case of genocide. He said that the US, the UK, and much of Europe were, quote, wholly complicit in the horrific assault by Israel on Gaza. Not only were these countries refusing to meet their treaty obligations under the Geneva Conventions, but they're also arming Israel and providing political and diplomatic cover. Do you believe that Western nations, who often, let's face it, lecture the rest of the world about human rights, just as the Foreign Minister of South Africa recently told me on this program, are the ones fueling this war, that they're the ones violating their treaty obligations?
So again, what I have said publicly...
But yes or no, do you believe that they are violating treaty obligations?
Well, it's not so easy to say that, but what is clear is that they have an obligation, and this is an obligation at international law, to ensure that they do not do anything that could enable the commission of crimes. And that has been we have been very clear.
But that's not enough. Do you feel that the UN itself is failing the people of Palestine, that it has lost its way when it comes to human rights, particularly when it has to do with Israel and Palestine, primarily because of the pressures from the United States, from Israel and other governments?
I think you have to make a distinction between the UN and the UN. You have the Security Council, that's one thing, and we know how dysfunctional the Security Council has been over many years on some of the big issues, including when it comes to Gaza, although it did now finally adopt a resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire.
But not a permanent ceasefire.
Not a permanent, but at least an immediate one. That's already a step forward. But it's also important to recognize that our humanitarian colleagues, including our colleagues from UNRWA, are working day and night in order to make sure that humanitarian aid is delivered against all odds. And as you know, unfortunately, the UN has lost 171 colleagues.
And
they
yet,
got killed.
And yet we don't hear a lot of outrage.
Well, I'm definitely outraged about that.
But there are no legal consequences.
We will see. I mean, there will be legal consequences because there has to be an inquiry into each and every death of a UN staff member.
You mentioned UNRWA. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, described the situation as outrageous, saying it makes it intentional to obstruct life-saving assistance during a man-made famine. The EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, has accused Israel of provoking famine in Gaza and using starvation as a weapon of war. These are damning, serious accusations. Do you agree with them?
Any starvation as a method of war is totally unacceptable, and it is indeed a war crime if it is proven that it was done intentionally. And it is clear that if you look at the trickle of humanitarian aid that gets into Gaza, especially now in the north, there are extremely serious concerns when it comes to this, and it is utterly unacceptable that we are watching Gaza as we speak on the brink of famine and hunger, and we know that people are already dying of hunger, and there needs to be an all-out effort to prevent this from happening.
How does that happen? You know the UN system extremely well. Why is it so powerless, so reluctant to push for accountability when powerful nations or their close allies are involved, is there a fear of political or financial retribution?
I can tell you, when it comes to accountability, my office has been clear for a very long time, because we have been monitoring and documenting human rights violations both in Gaza and in the West Bank for years. And one of the recurring findings has been the impunity and the fact that accountability needs to be served. So I hope that this current crisis is a wake-up call to take accountability more seriously. And the fact that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over it is extremely important. It's also important that there is this case before the International Court of Justice, because that is about accountability.
A lot of people, as you know, complain about the double standards within the United Nations system. They believe that its key organs are under the complete influence, not to say control, of the Permanent Five, and in many instances, the United States. You have said that the entrenched impunity reported by our office for decades cannot be permitted to continue. There must be accountability. You say on all sides for the violations that we've seen for over 5 decades. The question is again, though, how do you deliver this accountability? How do you deliver justice, which you say is a prerequisite for ending cycles of violence?
We will continue monitoring and documenting and making our reports public. That is part of the accountability framework. Then you have national courts that will apply what we call in the legal terms universal jurisdiction. We have seen in other type of conflict situations that actually justice is eventually served, and so I very much hope that also in this case it's going to happen.
How long will Palestinians have to wait?
Well, we don't know, but there are cases where things have gone to courts and they will be decided, and the fact that the International Criminal Court, for example, has jurisdiction over these crimes is already an important matter, and we hope that we will see soon developments in this direction. But perhaps also one other thing that I want to say, the UN, when it comes to us, the ones who work for the UN on a daily basis and who have been working for the UN for day and night for decades, it is clear that we represent the principles and the values and the norms that the UN stands for. We have been raising the alarm bells. We have made sure that there is a wake-up call, and we were the first ones to call for ceasefire. Now it is being picked up, and there is international consensus emerging that ceasefire is indeed what is required. We have also seen an international consensus emerge when it comes to any possible attack on Rafah, which would be an absolute catastrophe.
And you've also been warning about settler violence in the West Bank,
yes,
saying it has reached shocking new levels. Israel has refused you entry into the occupied Palestinian territory. Who has the power to change these dynamics? How important is it for you to go and see for yourself what's going on?
It's in any of these type of situations, of course, it is important that I can deploy a team that is able to investigate, that is able to look at the situation both in Gaza but also in Israel itself. So I keep making the call to Israel to allow myself and my team entry to Israel, and I hope they will heed that call.
What happens if they don't?
Well, then it is part of a catalogue of issues where you can say that international cooperation has been denied.
And yet where nothing really happens.
Let's see. I think we cannot, at the moment we can only document and catalogue, but eventually all these issues will come up in all kinds of court proceedings. Already now, if you look at the proceedings before the ICJ, for example, for the International Court of Justice, you will see that a lot of the documents that we have been providing over many years are actually used.
How can the United Nations stand for global human rights when, let's face it, the Security Council's veto power allows major violators to block any action against themselves or against their close allies? How do you address this inconsistency, this double standard?
So, human rights is not determined by the Security Council. Human rights is determined by the normative framework that was established in the wake of the Second World War, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that is a question that arises in each and every jurisdiction, in each and every country. So for us, we don't depend on the Security Council. Of course, we want the Security Council to work. In the current geopolitical context, it's not working in the way that it should. But this doesn't deter us from doing our job.
You say it doesn't deter you, but the veto has been used around 300 times, often to block UN Security Council action against mass atrocities and war crimes. Do you support Malaysia's recent proposal that the veto should not be used in situations involving genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes?
Absolutely. It is very important. And by the way, this is not just Malaysia. This has been a proposal by a number of countries for quite some time, that in the case of atrocity crimes, that the veto should not be used. And you see the other organ, the big organ, the General Assembly, which represents all member states, has eventually passed a resolution that each permanent member has to justify themselves before the General Assembly when they exercise the veto.
Should it be abolished to ensure a more timely and appropriate response to global crises?
Well, it is clear that if you look at the world today and if you look at the world then, in 1945, we are in a different world. The power dynamics have changed. We didn't have some of the countries represented even in the UN that are currently represented. So there is indeed a reform necessary for the Security Council, which looks at all these issues. And I hope, and this is not, by the way, just the Security Council, it's also the international financial institutions, because we have seen, especially after COVID, how much developing countries have suffered from the inequities that are inherent in the way that international financial institutions are, for instance, providing funding. So absolutely, we need an upgrade of all these institutions to work.
Should there be reform of the Human Rights Council? Because we often hear Western nations complain about the presence of what they say are notorious human rights violators on the Human Rights Council, saying that their membership undermines its credibility. Do you agree with them, or is that selective bias?
I think it is, first of all, extremely important that we have a Human Rights Council, because the Human Rights Council allows for, at the intergovernmental level, to have serious discussions about human rights. And frankly, there's not one single situation that I can think of that isn't somewhat discussed in the Human Rights Council. At least it gives me the chance in my global update to provide what I see happening around the world, and that's very important. So yes, I think we can always become better. Nobody is perfect, so of course the Council can be looked at from different perspectives, but it is important that we retain its functioning and that make it actually much more effective.
There are frequent calls for action against Russia and China for their violations of human rights, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's against the Uyghurs. They're not the only permanent members of the UN Security Council, though, that have violated international law, are they? Should the same standards apply to the other countries on the Council that also commit human rights abuses, the United States, France, the UK?
So, if you look at my statements, public statements, I have made public statements about each and every of the P5s in relation to different issues. So that shows that when it comes to the institution itself, we apply the same standards. We don't care whether it's a P5 or a not P5. We have to apply the same standards to everyone.
Whether it's Russia and China or the US and the UK?
That's correct.
But do you feel there's a tendency to take on the other countries much more often?
I mean, I think it's a question of what is happening in the world. I mean, frankly, the fact that there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine is quite unprecedented. I mean, the fact that you have a serious violation of the Charter in that way obviously triggers the fact that you have ongoing human rights violations, both in the occupied areas of Ukraine, as well as with the way that hostilities are conducted. Yes, that does raise a very incredibly serious preoccupations on our part. Of course, we have to report on that.
And if you have US or Western complicity?
We look at it from the same measure when it comes to all of these issues. Of course, sometimes it takes some time to document it, but we actually look at it in the same way. The leaders of the world remember that human rights is central to any of this, and that we actually take it much more seriously than what we have done so far.
High Commissioner Turk, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Despite the High Commissioner's noble intentions, there is little doubt that the UN human rights system is under threat. Today's selective government outrage and transactional diplomacy, as Human Rights Watch describes it, lays bare the inconsistencies and contradictions. While some countries are sanctioned for failing to abide by Security Council resolutions, others can flout international law at will with little or no consequence. Israel's relentless war on Gaza has exposed once again the blatant double standards of our current system, where a government's decades-old entrenched impunity is allowed to continue at the expense of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter: justice, accountability, and basic human rights and dignity for all. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.